Let's run an experiment. If I say the word apple, what shows up in the thought space? Do you see an image of an apple? Do you see a background? Is there color? Is there texture to the skin? Or is it something a little different? Do you see the symbolic language representation of apple? Do you see an image of A-P-P-L-E? Maybe it's something else. Perhaps you hear the sound apple and that's what shows up in the thought space. This is pretty interesting. Everyone seems to have a little bit of a different way of thinking when thoughts tend to arise. It could be a combination of these, yet imagery of the symbolic language or imagery of the object itself can arise, and other times it can just simply be almost a self-narration of the word apple. To think of apple, we hear our own voice saying apple in the mind. It really doesn't matter how these things tend to show up. Yet it can be really useful to know what quality thoughts tend to take, and in this practice of inquiry, to experiment to see if there are other aspects of thought that we can play with. If you usually see apple in an image, can you now see image of the language? Can you hear the word apple? Can you hear it in your voice? Can you hear it in someone else's voice? Can you hear it as a whisper? Being able to pick out exactly how thoughts tend to arise can be rather useful, especially when some thoughts tend to be so utterly quiet and under the radar that we don't realize that they're occurring, even in places where we feel that we are present and in the moment. How do you think? Do you think in imagery? Do you think in detailed imagery? Do you think in accordance to language? Do you see the words almost typed out in the mind? Do you hear your own voice through a form of narration? Perceiving the texture, the flavor, the temperature of these thoughts can bring us a little bit closer to this moment. Being aware of how we tend to think, especially in habitual patterns, is likely to glean a lot more awareness of this moment. Yes, while it is useful to point out a thought and let the fish swim by, so to speak, it might be useful to be able to see how thoughts tend to arise for each of us. See if you can pay attention. How does a thought tend to show up? And if you can see that more clearly, it will be a lot easier to point them out as you move into the sensational space of this direct experience.